All right, everyone. Welcome to the Stoa. Today we have Ben Burgis back here at the Stoa. Ben is a philosophy instructor at Georgia State University. He's the author of a book, I have it right here, Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left. And he just released a new book called Canceling Comedians While the World Burns, a critique of the contemporary left. This is a book about the so-called cancel culture and Ben's critique on it. And so I'm quite excited for this session and how it's going to work. I'm going to tag in Ben in a moment. He's going to share his screen and share a few slides and his thoughts, and then we'll pivot to Q&A. If you have any questions, put them in the chat. I'll call on you, ask your questions to Ben. If you don't want to be on YouTube, because this will be on YouTube, indicate that, and I will read your question on your behalf. So that being said, Ben, welcome back to the Stoa.
Oh, thank you so much, Peter. So, all right. So yeah, just going to do a short presentation and read a little bit from the book. And then with any luck, we will have enough time for, 20, 30 minutes of Q&A at the end. So excited to talk about it with you guys. All right. So the book is, as Peter said, it's called Canceling Comedians While the World Burns, a critique of the contemporary left. You can see here the page to get it from Red Emma's, which is where I try to steer people to because it's a worker-owned bookstore in Baltimore. And I like worker-owned bookstores because I like worker ownership. I like economic democracy. This is a big part of my politics, which sometimes confuses people because they see in the title a critique of the contemporary left, and they don't quite know what direction this critique is going to come from. So here you see, not at Red Emma's, but at Amazon, a dissatisfied customer who is very upset that he read this book, he saw a critique of the contemporary left in the title, and then he finds out that I don't like Tucker Carlson or Barry Weiss, that even though I criticize Antifa, I don't hate it like he does. I say bad things about the way that policing currently works in America, etc. And this is not at all apparently what he was expecting. So what is the point, and why am I critiquing the contemporary left? What perspective am I doing that from? And what I would say about that is that all of my political goals are exactly what you would think they are. Given, I'm a columnist for Jacobin magazine, DSA gets some money from me every month. I'm a leftist. I want to do all the things that the left says that it wants to do. I want to end the wars. I want to give everybody health care. I want workers' control of production. So why is it that I'm writing a book that's called A Critique of the Contemporary Left? Well, my late friend Michael Brooks put this well once on his weekend show that he was doing at the very end of his life with Anna Kasparian on the Jacobin YouTube channel, where he said saying that somebody's against the left because they're criticizing it is like saying that a basketball coach who makes his team do drills is against the team. That could not be further from the point. And in particular, when I think about the things about the contemporary left that I think are critiquable, then I'm thinking about a couple of things. So Peter mentioned in his intro concept of cancel culture, which there's obviously a reference to in the title of the book. And this is a word that gets batted around and people argue about what it means and where it comes from. I would say you could read an article I wrote in Jacobin about this called So You're Still Being Publicly Shamed to get the long form version of this. But very briefly, I would say that I think that cancel culture is not something that's specific to the left. I think it is a disease of our late capitalist hellscape that impacts the entire political spectrum. We could give plenty of examples of right-wingers piling on people online, piling on some Starbucks barista for saying F Trump and trying to get her fired. We could give tons of examples of centrists trying to do the same thing to Bernie-crats. But in the book, I'm particularly interested in the left on left manifestation of it. So like I said, I think this has broader causes. I would point to the fact that we live in an incredibly atomized society where people often feel most connected to others online, that the social media companies that host a lot of those interactions are for-profit companies whose feedback loops often incentivize our worst impulses because they keep people clicking. And also the fact that on the other end, in terms of the possible effects of all of this, that we live in a society where most people work at places with at-will employment and no meaningful recourse against being arbitrarily fired, all of which I think creates a very cancelly cocktail of cultural trends. But I'm most concerned with the left on left version because I think that and this ties in with what I say in the rest of the book, that there are reasons why the left, the part of the political spectrum with which I identify, is particularly vulnerable to this stuff, because it's not just that these are trends coming in from the larger culture, although I think that's also true, but I think that there are homegrown left pathologies that also make us very vulnerable to this kind of thing. So as a small example, the woman in the screen is the very famous left-wing YouTuber ContraPoints. There was a time a couple of years ago when she gave a few seconds of voice work in one of her videos to a man named Buck Angel. Buck Angel is a trans icon from a previous generation, and somebody who Natalie Wynn, the YouTuber known as ContraPoints, had admired very much for a long time, and found inspiring because he was a trans icon from a time without a lot of trans icons. But he also has some views that are very controversial within the contemporary left and the contemporary trans community. He has seems to have a view that is sometimes called trans medicalism, that you're only really trans if you have diagnosable gender dysphoria and you're seeking medical transition, which for obvious reasons, lots of non-binary or even binary trans people don't like. And without getting into the specifics of that controversy, the really remarkable thing is that Natalie herself doesn't agree with this view. She's said many times that she doesn't agree with this view. She's criticized it. She's done videos arguing that non-binary gender identities exist and should be recognized. But her failure to disown Buck Angel and denounce him, right? She was willing to say that she disagreed with him. She was unwilling to denounce him and not have anything to do with him, was enough to bring on the torrent of abuse that she describes in this clip.
And I think it's time we take a look at what canceling really is. I've given you enough context now for you to understand what I'm about to show you, which is what I saw on my timeline every day for nearly a month. All these tweets are from the aftermath of my uploading Opulence 2 months ago, when the Buck Angel scandal first broke. And someone better hold my hand now, because this gets ugly. Hey, if any of you still support ContraPoints after her bigging up and collaborating with notable TERF favorite and true scum Buck Angel, you're no friend to gender non-conforming, non-passing, and non-binary trans people. Fuck her, and fuck her fucking rift. I am absolutely furious right now. Weird how I'm 30 and trans and manage not to be a true scum? Maybe I'm just some kind of anomaly. Or maybe ContraPoints is a conniving rat-fucking capo who could do with a fully wound backhand to the mouth. Since I'm out of Twitter jail now, I just want to say, fuck ContraPoints, her sycophantic stance, and all her bread tube chums who close ranks to protect her after she throws the rest of the trans community under the bus for profit. Natalie Wynn is a fucking grifter. ContraPoints videos are now just style over substance, so that explains why she took to TERF ideology so well. ContraPoints working with True Scum now definitively proves that pretty much everyone defending ContraPoints just hates NBs, and are also True Scum. Legit gonna start unfollowing peeps that continue to follow ContraPoints at this point. Do note my wording of pretty much everyone. I know there are some that were probably blindsided by this somehow. So long as you know that ContraPoints is True Scum, you're safe and cool. Eat shit, Natalie. For someone who used to identify as genderqueer, we expected more from you, but I guess when your head's this far up your own ass, it's hard to consider others. ContraPoints, more like disappoints. That's a good one. If you're gonna drag me, at least be funny. Fuck Buck Angel. Fuck ContraPoints. fuck any real transsexual. Fuck your grift. Here's what hashtag ContraPoints stands don't understand. If Natalie refuses to accept that she has an apology to make and continues profiting from it, it will become our responsibility to work on deplatforming her just like every other racist, sexist, bigoted content creator. No one has actually suggested or attempted to actually cancel her, but the longer this goes on without an apology and commitment to do better, the stronger the case becomes for actively working to deplatform her. So, in other words, no one has suggested we cancel her, but we should cancel her. Great. Can everyone finally agree that ContraPoints belongs directly inside a garbage can? Here I am, sweetie. ContraPoints collaborating with Angel Buck. Angel Buck. Thanks for letting us all know that you had no idea who he even was until Twitter notified you what to be outraged about. ContraPoints collaborating with Angel Buck, a trans medicalist who once outed a trans person to try and destroy them, and supporting him because he looks and sounds like a proper man isn't a small itty-bitty tipsy-topsy fucking mistake. This is a huge deal. ContraPoints could be literally collaborating with Hitler. We have a...
And it goes on like that. So if you think about what's going on here, I think that some of this, there's a larger scale explanation as far as what happens throughout the entire political spectrum that we just talked about a little bit. But I also think that there's something else going on. There's something a little bit more specific. To think about what's more specific, one more very short video clip from the beginning of this. These are scenes from the last convention of the Democratic Socialists of America 2 years ago.
Right.
Quick point of privilege. Quick point of personal privilege.
Yes.
Guys, first of all, James Jackson, Sacramento, he, him. I just want to say, can we please keep the chatter to a minimum? I'm one of the people who's very, very prone to sensory overload. There's a lot of whispering and chatter going on. It's making it very difficult for me to focus. Please, can we just, I know we're all fresh and ready to go, but can we please just keep the chatter to a minimum? It's affecting my ability to focus. Thank you.
Thank you, comrade. Okay, is there a speaker against name, chapter, pronoun?
Point of personal privilege.
Yes.
Please do not use gendered language to address everyone.
All right, so just to review, you have the convention of DSA. In the first clip, somebody is objecting to whispering and crosstalk because there could possibly be people in the room who have some incredibly rare disability where they're particularly prone to noise sensitivity. And we're still selected to go to a 1,500 person convention. And then in the response, the second delegate says, objects to the first delegate because they started their complaint with the phrase, hey guys, and hey guys is gendered language. Now, there are a lot of things that you could say about this scene. For one thing, you could object that that these clips were put together by right-wing pundits who obviously want to make DSA look bad. And that's absolutely true. These are the worst moments that are cherry-picked from a long weekend. There are lots of things that happened that would tell a very different story if you chose those clips, but also they're not fake. This is not staged. This is also not a matter of somebody sending in Breitbart-style hidden cameras to capture these images. DSA was streaming this on purpose to the entire world. Everybody knew that it was being streamed to the entire world, and still the delegates that you see in here felt the need to do this kind of competitive, moralistic one-upsmanship. So what's going on there? I think that part of the explanation beyond general canceler trends and larger American culture is actually specific to the left, because any political perspective meaningfully the left of mainstream liberalism in the United States has been very far out in the cold for a very long time in American politics. If you think about the careers of even people I would regard as good, honorable social democrats like Bernie Sanders, he's until the last few years, he was somebody who maybe you saw at C-SPAN at 1 in the morning. If you encountered his name, that was the context. And certainly anything more radical than the Bernie platform, like a lot of what DSA stands for, was completely off the table. And under circumstances in which you're not meaningfully connected to real politics, that real politics is being exclusively framed as a battle between mainstream liberalism and forces to its right. So you can just kind of stand by the sidelines, waving around a sign. Then I think it's very easy to fall prey to what in the book I call the pathologies of powerlessness, which is a tendency to see radical politics not as a serious effort to change the concrete world, but as a way of taking a kind of symbolic moral stand against the many injustices of the world around you, which of course are very real injustices. But if you see the point of politics as a symbolic moral performance of your opposition to those injustices, as a way of indicating that I'm better than that, I reject all of that, I don't like any of this. The danger is that it's very easy to stop worrying about how anybody outside of your bubble is going to receive what you're saying, what you're doing. Think about this clip that we just watched from the DSA convention. The last thing on the minds of any of these speakers seems to be, how would anybody whose material interests would align with our platform, who we might be able to win over, is going to perceive any of this? Is this a club that they're particularly going to want to join? Instead, the mindset seems to be that of people guarding the entrance to a clubhouse to make sure, hey, you say that you're taking the right kind of moral stand against the injustices around us, but are you really? Is your moral stand against this really as good as mine? I don't know. Let's investigate. Let's check before we let you into the clubhouse. So a lot of the things that I criticize the book, and it's about more than canceling, never mind canceling comedians, although we will go back to that in just a minute, I think trace back to a culture of counterproductive moralism. And when I say that, I think that could be misinterpreted.
Quick point of privilege.
To make a couple of basic distinctions. So the first one is when we talk about moralism and say that moralism is bad, that, I'm critiquing the excesses of moralism on the left, it's very easy for some people to hear that as criticizing morality or saying it doesn't matter if something is morally wrong. That's not the point at all. Moralism and morality are not the same thing. Moralism is an excessive focus on evaluation of the moral character of individuals, which on paper is not what the left is supposed to be about at all. We're supposed to be about criticizing structures and institutions and systems rather than blaming the individual people caught within those systems. In fact, not only, I would argue, is moralism not just a function of morality. After all, forgiveness and redemption are also moral impulses. The impulse to focus on unjust structures rather than the agency of individual people within those structures is also a moral impulse. But we could actually go a step further than that and say that moralism is morally bad. We can critique moralism for moral reasons. And this takes us beyond the primary point of the book, although I do want to get back to that point by the end. Because the primary point of the book, as I was trying to indicate with that analogy from Michael Brooks about basketball drills, is about the ways in which what the left does is strategically counterproductive, that this kind of excessive moralism is bad because it stops us from creating a more broadly appealing left that can win over all the people that we would need to win over in order to achieve political power and carry out our stated political objectives. But you could also make a different kind of critique, which is a directly moral critique, that this is just a bad way for human beings to interact with each other. If you think about all of those people spitting toxic bile at ContraPoints because of her failure to disassociate with somebody who had bad views, this is just a bad mode of human interaction. Moralism, you could argue, actually is immoral because it makes us less empathetic. That instead of attending to the nuances of human character and behavior and the respects in which, as David Hume says, we all float in between vice and virtue, the impulse is to sort everybody cleanly into the good basket or the bad basket in order to decide whether to celebrate or yell at them. And you can critique that on moral grounds. Another way that you can criticize moralism, and this gets into the part that I want to read out of the book, is, not as important as those first two perhaps, but also one that I think is not uninteresting, which is that moralism is something that makes us very, very bad art critics. Because if your focus is on evaluating the moral character of the artist, whether we're talking about a stand-up comedian or a filmmaker or a novelist, then that makes you read everything that goes on in that work of art as a moral message that you can evaluate as being morally good and morally bad, which again is flattening, makes you miss nuance, makes you miss ambiguity, makes you miss humor. So for example, in the book, I take the example of Dave Chappelle's stand-up special, Sticks and Stones, in which Chappelle, being the guy on the left, which was widely criticized, certainly, in thousands of tweets by people who found various jokes in that special objectionable, but also by, apparently serious critics at places like Salon and Slate, and sometimes by those critics in ways that almost make you wonder whether they understood that they're watching a comedy special. For example, there's a joke on that special, which, it's not a joke that, that I would tell my grandmother, but it did make me laugh, about Michael Jackson, and Chappelle says that he is what's known on the street as a victim blamer. And so his first thought when he heard about the Michael Jackson molestation scandal was, okay, but what were those kids wearing? Which was mentioned, I remember in one of these reviews, like, oh, this is a very offensive thing that he said about Michael Jackson's victims, which makes me wonder whether the reviewer understood that the purpose of a comedy special is to tell jokes, and that the nature of jokes is that you don't actually mean what you're saying. So again, one of the reasons that this can be important is that it's strategically counterproductive. That's the focus of the book, both the initial chapter, which is the chapter about the comedy wars, and the rest of the book that details this larger critique of the left. You can find a straightforward example of that in the last image on the right of the comedian and podcaster Joe Rogan. You can look at what happened after Joe Rogan endorsed Bernie Sanders last year and said he was going to vote for him just before the Iowa caucus. And lots of people said, oh, this is very bad that Bernie Sanders is accepting the support of this terrible, problematic person, Joe Rogan. And most of the people who said that, I'm sure, were people who were operating in bad faith, were supporters of other candidates. But I saw a lot of people with that red rose democratic socialist emoji in their Twitter handles who were echoing the same point, which speaks to those larger pathologies about thinking about how power, about power, and if the point is to take power in the real world, or if the point is to exhibit a kind of symbolic moral opposition to the injustices that surround us. So what I want to do, I think I'm not going to read as much as I thought I was going to, because I want to make sure I leave time, like a reasonable amount of time at the end for Q&A, but I want to read just a little bit from the comedy chapter of the book, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So in the comedy chapter of the book, I've just finished talking about the Dave Chappelle case, and I say this: to anticipate a standard response, I'm perfectly aware that scolding someone for telling an ambiguous joke is as much of an expression of free speech as the joke itself. While free speech concerns are legitimate, when cancel culture intersects with the semi-feudal structure of largely non-unionized American workplaces, or the silencing powers of the corporate oligarchs who control so many tech platforms, that's not the issue here. A different and better reason to dislike the practice of moralistically policing the boundaries of acceptable comedy, and a lot of the responses this practice inspires, is that all of this is very bad for comedy as an art form. Nigerian British socialist Ralph Leonard recently explored this in his essay, Dave Chappelle and Comedy. I find myself, Leonard writes, in the weird position of being against both dominant sides of the comedy wars. On the one side, you have the likes of Samantha Bee and Hannah Gatsby, with their woke anti-comedy, which is often very forced and contrived, obsessed with pushing the right political and ideological message. Play it safe instead of trying to engage with people, whether through humor or other means, and you will always end up sounding tediously unfunny, preachy, and condescending. However, the antithesis of the woke brigade isn't much better. The anti-woke faction, drawn mainly from the alt-right, portray themselves as called countercultural insurgents who are reclaiming comedy from wokeness, yet their approach of giving PC the middle finger is very infantile. He gives some examples of that, and then he says, I'm not outraged or offended by them. It takes a lot more than that to get me riled up. I just find their stuff boring. In fact, this is me again, it's gotten to the point where you often have to slog past the boring stuff to get to the good part of a good comedy special. When Bill Burr spends 10 minutes at the beginning of his otherwise brilliant 2019 special Paper Tiger talking about how easily offended everyone is today, his irritation is too raw and his take is too simple for him to have anything funny to say about it. The special only gets good when he starts talking about himself. And Burr is an extraordinarily talented comedian who's only just now gotten to the point in his career when he's putting out his best stuff. Just try imagining the stale, repetitive anti-SJW jokes you're likely to get from multitudes of hacks and has-beens. Leonard continues, I am of the George Carlin school of thought. You should be able to make a joke about absolutely anything. No subject should be taboo or have metaphorical barbed wire fence around it. Not race, rape, transgenderism, Islam, 9/11, or the Holocaust. No topic at all. It depends on how the joke is constructed, how the hyperbole works, and most importantly, whether or not it's funny. If it is funny, does it have any depth to it? Okay, I'm broadly sympathetic to Leonard's stance, although it's worth noting two things. First, while Carlin was in practice, freewheeling enough about where he aimed his jokes that I see why Leonard attributes this principle to him. If you watch old clips of Carlin talking about comedy, he does express some reservations about punching down. Second, and more importantly, I think it's worth being cautious and realistic about the extent to which any of us completely know ourselves when it comes to any of this stuff. It's far too easy to delude yourself into thinking that you don't have any fenced off areas because you have yet to hear anyone crack a joke about one of yours. Then again, when that does happen, a lot depends on how well the comedian pulls you in. Here's a small example of what I mean. David Feldman has a long career as a stand-up and a comedy writer. He's written for everyone from Jon Stewart to Triumph the Insult Comic Dog. On the non-comedy side of his career, he's the co-host of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I've been lucky enough to be a regular guest on a solo podcast, The David Feldman Show. That means I regularly share episode lineups with another of David's regular guests, Jackie the Joke Man Martling, who was the main writer for Howard Stern back when I was in high school. When I started writing about politics, that's not a regular co-billing I would have predicted, but I get a big kick out of it. David does long episodes, and the tone varies a lot from segment to segment. At the 2-hour mark, he might be yakking it up with Jackie. He does this thing where Martling will tell a particularly off-color joke, and David will say, Jackie, no, almost like he's in physical pain. But back at the 1-hour mark, when he's interviewing me about the difference between Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, he's deadly serious. In fact, David displays more unfiltered anger about injustices ranging from de facto racial segregation in the public school system to the myriad ways that insurance companies screw over people trying to get life-saving medicine than just about anyone else I know in left media. After a synagogue shooting, it says something deeply depressing about how many hate crimes and mass shootings there have been in the last few years that I can't remember which synagogue shooting. He wanted to ask me about gun control. He built up to the question like this. Look, I know that anti-Semitism will always exist, and he paused for a perfectly timed beat before continuing, as long as I do this show. I'm sure that the moment loses something in a description like this, but I found it hilarious at the time. I should add that while my family background is secular and ethnically mixed, part of that background is Ukrainian Jewish. I inherited pretty stereotypically Jewish looks, and I've had an anti-Semitic remark or two directed at me over the course of my life. It's not a frequent occurrence, and it's not particularly traumatic, but it does happen, and I've never found it funny. Good comedy, or at least good comedy of a certain kind, works by seducing us into laughing at things that we normally think of as extremely unfunny, in much the same way that good literature often seduces us into identifying with characters that we disapprove of in real life. The function of good art is often to make our inner lives more interesting by making us extremely uncomfortable. Getting mad at someone for not being seduced into laughing at taboo material is asinine. You might as well get mad at someone you have a crush on for not finding you attractive. But the less people worry about whether it's okay to search for humor in this or that fenced off area. And the more they worry about how to do so in a way that sucks us into laughing about it, the better comedy will be as an art form, which is exactly what it is. Comedy is a form of entertainment that, when executed with enough skill and vision to have a deeper effect than just eliciting a quick laugh in the moment, becomes a form of art. What it is not, any more than novels, movies, or prestige TV, is a way of changing the world. American progressives in particular have often had trouble with that distinction. Think about the way that legions of liberal or even radical viewers related to Jon Stewart and The Daily Show during the Bush years, or the way that in the Trump era, the marvelous Mrs. Maisel has revived the secular sainthood of Lenny Bruce. There's a deeply embedded idea in the American progressive imagination that comedians are bold, important truth tellers who change society simply by speaking truth to power, the way a court jester can get away with telling the king that the peasants are starving. One problem with this fantasy is that speaking truth to power is wildly overrated. By and large, the powerful know the truth. If you're worried about starving peasants, don't bother trying to appeal to the conscience of the king. If the king had a functioning conscience, he wouldn't be able to hold on to his throne in the face of rival aristocrats and scheming usurpers. You're better off organizing the peasants themselves into a militant movement for land reform. On the West Wing, unscrupulous Republicans were always reduced to silence after they were dressed down in a particularly eloquent way by President Bartlett or some other speechifying liberal. The memory of Joseph Welk's 1954 takedown of Joe McCarthy, "Have you no decency, sir?" at long last, looms large in this view of how politics works. In the version of the fantasy on the display in the West Wing, deadly serious politicos, rather than disarmingly goofy court jesters, are the ones somehow defeating powerful adversaries just by being so damn good at speaking truth to them. But the expectation that something along those lines should work was reflected in February 2016, when about 1 million heartbreakingly earnest liberals got way too excited about going on social media and sharing comedian John Oliver's 22-minute segment, Donald Trump. The most memorable part of the segment was Oliver's gleeful discovery that the original surname of the Donald's ancestors had been Drumpf, seemingly convinced that the mere repetition of this name would have some sort of quasi-magical effect. Legions of liberals spent years calling Trump Drumpf. Sadly, it doesn't seem to have had any particular effect on the voters in the Rust Belt swing states who sent Drumpf to the Oval Office. It's also worth noting that the anti-communist witch hunts in which McCarthy initially played a major role lasted long after his iconic exchange with Jack Welch. The main investigatory body was the McCarthy-chaired Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations in the Senate, and all but the House Un-American Activities Committee, whose prestige slowly declined as times changed, but which kept going doing pretty much what McCarthy had been doing, with gradually diminishing returns until 1975. Good rhetoric is important. We can't persuade people to come around to our side without it. But good rhetoric about the other side being bad, whether presented in a serious or savagely funny way, doesn't actually do anything to make bad people go away. Another problem with this fantasy is that good comedians aren't necessarily good political commentators. Being able to be very funny about KFC famous bowls, or to do a hilarious impression of the speech patterns of George W. Bush, or even being able to do all that in a way that manages to convey something interesting about the human condition, does not mean that you have any special insight into what's wrong with our society or how it can be fixed. This became painfully obvious on October 30th, 2010, when Jon Stewart and his close collaborator, Stephen Colbert, actually managed to bring a couple 100,000 people to march through the streets of Washington, D.C. to do something about what ailed American politics. They didn't use this rally to talk about single-payer healthcare, rebuilding the crumbling labor movement, or ending America's seemingly endless wars in the Middle East. Their big cause was politeness. I described the rally a little bit. I'll skip all that. And I say this, it's safe to say that none of this reflects well on Jon Stewart or Stephen Colbert. But there's a more basic question. Why would hundreds of thousands of people show up to a political rally organized by comedians in the first place? Some social media users who put rose emojis in their Twitter handles to signal their allegiance to democratic socialism will get outraged about the contents of Bill Burr's last Netflix special in such a deadly serious way. You'd think that Burr was running for a seat on the National Political Committee of the Democratic Socialists of America. This kind of thing is bad and embarrassing for at least 4 reasons. First, it makes for shallow criticism. Puritans of all political and religious flavors tend to make lousy art critics for the simple reason that they read every poem as a manifesto and read every line of that manifesto in a dully literalistic way. Did Andres Serrano take a picture of a plastic crucifix drowning in his own urine? Well, it must mean that he hates Christianity so much he wants to pee on it. If Bill Burr performs an angry rant about women in the context of a special largely devoted to both funny and painful reflections on his lifelong struggle with anger management, that means that he's telling his audience exactly what he really thinks about women. No need to think about any of it any more deeply than that. Second, for the reasons laid out so well by Ralph Leonard, it's bad for comedy as an art form. Third, it reflects a basic confusion about the difference between comedy and politics. Feeling betrayed when Dave Chappelle tells a joke that reveals that he doesn't share all of your moral and political values is the flip side of the same ridiculous coin as following your favorite late night host through the streets of Washington, D.C. holding a protest sign. The final problem, the one most relevant to the overall thesis of this book, is that while online outrage mobs are pretty impotent when it comes to changing the larger world, Chappelle and Burr's careers will be just fine. These mobs do often succeed in making leftists look like humorless scolds. This needlessly alienates all of the regular people watching from the bleachers. I can almost hear some readers of the Rose Emoji Twitter variety saying, well, it shouldn't alienate them. People are dying because they can't afford insulin. Anyone who can't see that there are more important things at stake here than the fact that some leftists are annoying is worthless anyway. And that reaction makes a certain amount of sense if you don't really believe in changing the world. And deep down, you see your politics as a symbolic performance, a way of taking a stand against insurmountably powerful opposition. Hey, at least I said something, and that makes me better than everyone who said nothing. If, on the other hand, you hold out hope that you might win, and really, if you've given up on that, what's the point? Then you need to think hard about how to appeal to regular people who don't spend all day, every day reading and tweeting about politics. If someone really takes the time, if someone rarely takes the time to reflect on their political beliefs, and they only happen to notice your existence when you were being a ridiculous scold, they're not going to stick around to notice all the good points that you make the rest of the time. Finding ways to get basically apolitical normies excited about fighting for a better world can be tricky under the best of circumstances. I certainly don't claim to have all the answers, but I'm pretty certain that making ourselves look like overgrown hall monitors is unhelpful.
Awesome. Thank you, Ben. So we have about 20 minutes. Feel free to put your question in the chat. I'll call on you. You can ask your question to Ben. Warm up Ben with a question or two. So one thing I'm interested in is kind of getting, like, sensing into the contours of the mimetic space of a left, and that perhaps is like a different question, but you know, you have like breadtube, dirtbag left,
Yeah.
Antifa, Extinction Rebellion, all these different like BML. And I'm curious, like, what segment of this kind of the left is doing the cancellation? Like what are like the main culprits here? And I just, as like I'll share this as a kind of perhaps a case study.
Yeah.
Years ago, there was this news article of this celebrity I quite liked. I can't remember who it was or what they even said, but something innocuous. And then they're like, Twitter cancels this person. I'm like, oh no, I like this person. And I went on Twitter, and there's like literally like 3 tweets that just like dunked on this person. I'm like, that's it? And then this mainstream like news thing just like made a big deal out of it. And if you just look at that, you look like, oh my God, everyone's out to get this person. And so there's this weird interplay between like legacy media and this Twitter mob. Yeah, so I'll just throw that as a case study if you have anything to say about either of those.
Yeah. So I guess I'd say a couple things about that. I mean, I think that it's certainly the case that, I mean, very often, you know, given the collapse of legacy media, I mean, you know, just bluntly, editing has taken a hit everywhere. And oftentimes, if you can reproduce like 3 tweets over the course of an article and sort of use them as evidence of something it's taken as evidence, and you have for all sorts of purposes, both the one that you mentioned and like, oh, people are saying blah blah blah, right? You know, like that's a sort of lazy journalist way of making a hook, and sometimes it literally just is those 3 people doing it. So I certainly wouldn't deny that happens. On the other hand, I do think that when it comes to whether the phenomenon exists, you know, very often I think that there are cases where there are, 1,000 people, rather than just 3 people piling onto somebody, denouncing them, saying they should be deplatformed, trying to get them fired. I think that happens quite a bit. Unfortunately, not just in the left, but in general, which is a point I want to come back to in just a second. But I think that oftentimes people who deny that it's a problem, I think there's this interesting tension in their view, because sometimes they want to say, oh, what you're really talking about is just accountability culture, which is a good thing. But then other times they say, oh, look, none of this really exists. Everybody's fine. Nobody's, nobody's really suffered, because of any of this. And well, hell, if nobody's suffered, I don't know what kind of accountability we're talking about here. I mean, like if you really are just talking about people say, oh, criticism isn't canceling, it's like, okay, but you have to pick between that and this is a useful form of accountability that empowers oppressed people. Because if somebody's literally just being criticized, they haven't suffered in any way, then there's no accountability, there are no consequences there. And oftentimes I think that this is taken in some really absurd directions. So I mentioned in the book very briefly the case of the Des Moines Register reporter Aaron Calvin, who destroyed the budding career of the 24-year-old subject of what was supposed to be a feel-good story by digging up and exposing the bad tweets that that he posted as a teenager, when he said probably things that were in a dumb teenage way, trying to be edgy, and ended up being very offensive. And the response is that okay, this kid was destroyed, this 24-year-old who'd won this contest that his article was about. But then Aaron Calvin had his own long forgotten bad tweets dug up and exposed in retaliation, and he was fired. But through the whole process, Calvin doggedly insisted that cancel culture doesn't exist, even after he lost his job for this, which I think tells me that that sort of ideological conviction runs very deep. So I do want to, I don't want to spend too much time on this because I want to make sure that there is time for questions from the audience, but I will just really quickly say, because you brought up a couple of things in that question. So yeah, I think oftentimes it is true that you have Twitter mobs who do what they do throughout the political spectrum. Like if you read John Ronson's book from 2015, So You've Been Publicly Shamed, which I think is the classic book on the larger phenomenon, one of his main examples involves this woman named Lindsay Stone, who was fired after being mobbed online by patriotic kind of right-wing pro-military people because of a jokey picture that she'd taken at Arlington National Cemetery. And that's like really actually one of the most harrowing stories in the book, what happened to this woman. So I think it does happen across the political spectrum. I think probably, people who would identify in that sort of, I mean, these are all very loose and fuzzy terms, but, you mentioned like that phrase, the dirtbag left. I think often what people who wouldn't mind being called that, are signaling is that they want to, have a form of leftism that's a little bit culturally loosened up, that isn't too attached to the more stridently moralistic, elements of certain kinds of performative wokeness, right? So I would say that's probably the most innocent, but I think it's a general problem. And then the last thing I just say, to go back to the point at the end of the reading, is like, yeah, very often Twitter mobs do what they do. I think it's bad and toxic in lots of ways, but also if we're talking about the long-term health of people's careers, oftentimes the victims are just fine, right? They're not like, they've gone through a very unpleasant experience, right? But they're not going to be deprived of all employment and everything going forward forever. But to me, to the extent, and it's complicated because sometimes people lose their jobs, sometimes people lose platforms, sometimes people suffer wildly undeserved reputational damage. But to the extent that it's true that people who are mobbed online are fine, to me, that really undermines the claim that this is a useful form of consequences or accountability or empowerment of oppressed people. I would say that if you're right that nobody really suffers, I think that strengthens the claim that everybody on the left should cut this out, because it doesn't actually serve our goals, even in terms of serving the dubious goal of punishing individual bad people. Instead, it just serves to reinforce an impression of the left that is powerfully unappealing to people who we want to win over.
Um, so I have a bunch of other questions, but I'll tag in other people now just to squeeze a few other voices in. This one is an interesting question, probably only received at a place like the Stoa. So Duncan, if I can take you in. You're on mute, Duncan.
Yep, unmuted here. Yeah, so it seems just like taking it to the root of cancel culture. It seems to come from a lot of trauma held in social bodies, individuals, groups, epigenetic conditioning, and the desire to express that is both a form of power and also a means of calling attention to a wound that might not have gotten a capacity to express it.
Mm-hmm.
And you look at comedy, that's kind of a rival means of expressing trauma. It's like a means of expressing these kind of systemic inequalities, but you laugh at them at the end. So I can kind of, at the one hand, think of it as a means, like cancel culture hates this because it's letting off the steam that would be going into their tea kettle. Like it's letting off as kind of a power, and it's a rival expression of trauma. So I'm just like curious to what extent like this is just a mode of trauma in the body that does not tolerate any other rivals in its expression. And the call to action or the question is like how to reframe to actually treat the trauma, the PTSD of which I see this as a symptom, rather than just an endless Russian doll hunt on like who is ultimately to blame that can never be fully sated. I mean, that's kind of my experience. But
yeah, great question. So I think that I agree that a lot of what's going on in this case is a expression of trauma of various kinds. That some in I mean, I think in some cases. I think that there are class dynamics to some of this. I think that oftentimes certain forms of canceling end up being really intense in certain organizations, certain segments of journalism and academia, where which are traditionally middle-class professions that have become ever more economically precarious, and there's sort of fewer ladders to fight over, and that that sometimes causes that to happen there. But I also think that there are people who, and that's, by the way, not to say that I don't, there isn't a real like that anybody who's in the position that I'm describing doesn't have a very legitimate complaint. I actually think they do, even if it's misdirected. And in many other cases, I think that I think it's often very true that people have been brutalized in many ways that could lead them to enjoy kind of having this outlet, this steam valve, for expressing some of that, or to have or to at least value it. I think that what I was talking about specifically in terms of the left in the initial presentation, I think you could make a broader point about powerlessness in a more general sense in a larger society. That if you correctly feel that you don't actually have a lot of power in your day-to-day life, you don't have a lot of power over the conditions that the sort of larger conditions that shape your lives, certainly economic forces, although not exclusively those, then if you can at least get somebody fired, that you feel like you have some kind of power over something. And it's understandable, I think, that would be something that some people would value. But what I would argue is that it's ultimately a kind of junk energy, right? I mean, it scratches the itch for a second, but it doesn't make it go away. Now, what would make it go away? Some of what you're talking about, maybe nothing in the short term. I think that if you're right about the epigenetic stuff, and I think there's a whole larger discussion to be had about the science there. But if you are, then that that would be particularly worrying, because that would pretty much definitionally be long term. But I think that we can start to create a society that brutalizes people in fewer avoidable ways, right? That echoing what Freud said about psychotherapy. Corey Robbins says that the point of socialist politics, as he understands it, isn't to create a utopia, it's to reduce hysterical misery to ordinary unhappiness. That if you at least don't have to spend all of your time worrying about, hey, am I going to lose my job? If I lose my job, how am I going to pay for my family's health care? Am I going to be able to, I mean, there literally are people who die because Shane Patrick was somebody who did this because they can't, because like they set up a GoFundMe for medical costs, and it isn't fully funded. We live in a society that's increasingly economically precarious because of the gigification and Uberization of everything. So I do think there are some larger structural changes that could considerably reduce, the amount of misery and kind of floating frustration in the society that we live in. Not reduce it to nothing, obviously. Not mean that interpersonal conflict and misery goes anywhere. That's, I think, with us just as humans, forever. But reduce the crazy levels of these things that we are often living with right now. And I'm also cautiously optimistic that even a serious attempt at changing society in these ways, even before it's successful, can rechannel some of these energies. That if you see a serious possibility of meaningfully changing the society around you, suddenly just sort of getting to yell at people, suddenly just getting people fired is a lot, less. The siren song of that, has had its dial turned down a little maybe. And, you can, perhaps, both through the struggle to achieve that different kind of society, and then especially if you actually do achieve it, then I think going along with the Freud and Corey Robin point, we can get down to the kind of level of human misery that, that might actually be effectively channeled through traditional mechanisms like cathartic humor.
Awesome. Thank you, Duncan, for that question. We'll sneak in one more. Hannah, you had a question.
Hi, Ben. Thanks for the presentation. That was really interesting. So my question is, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Peter's journal, but he uses this phrase, seducing the culture. Mm. And I'm hoping that that's just going to make sense. So my question is, if the left is caught up in gatekeeping each other, they're probably not likely to arrive at the kind of conclusions that you have by themselves quickly enough. So how do we seduce the left into seducing the rest of the people with this less yelling at each other approach?
Yeah, I think it's a difficult question. I think that part of it, unfortunately, I just want to flag at the outset, I'm not going to have a great answer to, because I think there is part of this that is not entirely under our control. That if you try to be as I do, probably controversial here, we could have a whole, we could do a whole hour on this. But if you have a basically materialist view of the world, you think that the ideas that are in people's heads at any given time, don't come at me with sophisticated philosophical objections to the phrase ideas in people's heads. You know what I mean? That the ideas that are in people's heads at any given time are not decisive, in causing, outcomes in the larger world. They have a role to play for sure. But if you think that underlying economic relationships, or, like balance of power in the larger world is something that is going to tend to have a determinative role, then unfortunately, we're faced with the prospect that some of this might depend on what happens, not in kind of discussions like this one, or people reading a book like this one, but that you need sort of larger catalysts from in order to even create the possibility for building something better. I think you can look at a very small way at the way in which some of this stuff has gotten much worse, I would argue, since the election, because anybody with sort of broadly lefty social democratic or socialist impulses, as long as those Bernie Sanders campaigns for president were going on in 2016 and 2020, had some kind of larger thing that was actually happening in the real world to pin some hopes on. And since that went away, I think disorientation has made some of the stuff, unfortunately, much worse. Now, that said, I think that I hope, I've got to hope that what you're suggesting is at least partially possible. I certainly wouldn't have bothered, writing this if I didn't hold out any hope in that. And I think that I would say a couple things. First of all, that some people can be convinced to just embrace these conclusions and actually change their behavior accordingly. There are lots of earnest people who act in ways that that are criticized in the book for good reasons, and could actually be convinced to do better. Also, I think that even when that's not the case, even if worst case scenario, nobody is convinced, I think there's still some value to making this kind of critique, because it usefully signals that it's a widely felt objection, both to people who might drift away from the left because of alienation from all of these symptoms, or who are outside of the left, who might be kept out of it, precisely by the impression that it's all like this. So I think sending the signal, hey, there are people who are on the inside who completely agree, who hate all of this just as much as you do, I think is a useful impulse to send. Then, on the last, I guess the last part of the answer, that I know how to give is just the power of setting some kind of positive example by planting a flag. I think that success breeds success, and that if you can, that if you manage to build useful left organizations, movements, campaigns that actually rack up wins in the real world, that has some salutary effect. And even in what I do, media commentary, I think that if you can present an image of a more nuanced, more appealing, more strategically savvy, not for nothing more funny, version of the left, I think that has some gravitational pull on its own. But I also definitely don't want to be like, let it get lost in all of this, that I'm under no illusions that those three elements add up to a complete and completely satisfying answer. So if you come up with one, do be sure to let me know.
Awesome. Thank you, Hannah.
I will. Thank you.
And I know you have to leave at the top of the hour, Ben. So any kind of closing thoughts, anything you'd like to leave us with?
No, I mean, I thank you so much for having me. I mean, I wish we had a little bit more time for discussion right now, but the questions that we did have time for, were really good and insightful. And yeah, hope to come back to talk to you guys soon.
Beautiful. So I'll make some closing announcements in a moment, but definitely check out Ben's book. I also recommend checking out Given the Argument. I quite like this book. I'm a big advocate of reasoning, and it's really good. So yeah, Ben, thank you so much for coming to the Stoa today. Love to have you back. And just to plug a couple events. Tomorrow we have Stephen Jenkinson coming. Where Are the Elders? Steph, I highly recommend this event. He's a crazy poet that talks in the death trade. And then on June 28th, The Future of the Left with Noam Chomsky and Natalie Wynn. ContraPoints are going to be in conversation. And Noam and Natalie both are critics of cancel culture. So that should be an interesting talk. So yeah, you can sign up on thestoa.ca. So that being said, Ben, everyone, thank you so much for coming to Stoa today.
Thank you.